So I'm going to go quickly through third line. You will never make a decision about third line, or you slightly, but it's very helpful to understand how third line works and to take some of the mystery out of third line. But also, you're going to have patients with third line that might come through your facilities, and you have to know a little bit about something about these drugs. So historically, what we used to do is the idea was the more resistance and mutations there were, the more ARVs we would throw at these patients. So we used to start off with 2 NRTIs and a darunavir, ritonavir, depending on their Stanford scores. Then we would add dolutegravir, and then we could add etravirine. And people ended up on these very complicated, difficult regimens. But we've now shifted how we thought about ARVs. So as you know, we're now actually retaining tenofovir in our second line. So we're retraining drugs like tenofovir, even though when we're actually using those mutations. But also in the old guideline, the previous guideline, we actually had a thing that if people failed on TLD1, we were going to use AZT, 3TC, atazanavir, ritonavir was the proposed second line after TLD1. We are not doing that. So actually now we're moving away from the strict first, second, third line, and we're like, if you're failing on dolutegravir, we're going to do a resistance test to figure out what's going on. And then previously we used to wait 2 years because dolutegravir was so tough. We would go, no, it's so difficult to get resistance. We're going to wait. But actually, once you've got viremia, some people might be running out of time. And so we are going to be doing resistance tests much earlier, or requesting resistance tests much earlier. So because of this, they've actually changed the name of the third line committee. It's now called the ADREC instead of the TLART, the ARV Drug Resistance Committee. And the definition of somebody who needs a third line or is on a third line is any patient who's got either PI resistance or any patient who's got INSTI resistance is considered a third line patient. So our third line drugs that we can quickly look at, dolutegravir is now starting to take in its place within our third line. So remember, we said dolutegravir also has this high genetic barrier. It's got great potency. Only one that beats it really is darunavir. And so that means we can now have TLD1 in first line. We can have TLD2 in second line if they failed on a TEE in the past. And then if they failed on a lopinavir-based regimen, there is a possibility to use TLD3, but there's certain criteria for that to happen. The other drug that we have is darunavir, ritonavir. And as I say, this is a super drug. It's very potent. It has a very high genetic barrier. The only thing we really didn't like about it is that it was a BD dosing, and it also has to be boosted with ritonavir. That always brings its own kettle of fish of problems. But what they have noticed, and it's already in the last couple of years, is that if there's no darunavir resistance, then you can actually use a once daily dosing of what we call the 800-100. It comes in a 450 tablets. And so patients can end up being on, if they're on Truvada, for example, and darunavir, they can actually be on a once daily dosing with literally 3 tablets. So that's, it's becoming easier and easier, these third line regimens. But if there's any darunavir mutations or resistance, we still have to use the twice daily dose. The fly in the ointment with darunavir, and that's why it's important for you guys to know, is that you cannot give it with rifampicin. So if you've got a patient on TB treatment on darunavir, ritonavir, you have to switch out that rifampicin with rifabutin, or you'll have to chat to see whether we can actually get away with a TLD3 in a patient like that. So please watch out for that. The other drug that's going to become important is tenofovir alafenamide. It's a different type of tenofovir. It's a different prodrug. So we don't really like using a bacavir in third line because it's got quite a low potency as well. We don't have as much evidence for the bacavir mutations as we do for the tenofovir mutations. So it becomes a problem with our patients who's got renal issues. And so TAF, tenofovir alafenamide, has now finally been approved by the NDOH. It's now on tender for the EML. It's going to be in our new EMLs, and there's now we've agreed on specific NDOH TAF formulations. So just like we've got a Truvada, there's a TAF and FTC combination, which you can give from an EGR of 30 mils per of 30. And so please note, there's now something called TAF-LD. It's like TLD, but with TAF. So again, it's a combination medicines that we can use for our patients right down to a GFR of 30. And then TAF you can also use on its own, actually under 30, but we don't have those preparations. So under 30 mils, you'll probably use a bacavir 3TC as we're doing at the moment. And you can give it from 25 kilograms in children and adults. So what we no longer use, and I'm therefore not going to spend much time on it, Voltagravir is one of the old drugs, got a very low genetic barrier, causes cross-resistance to dolutegravir. So if you do see anybody on Voltagravir, please talk to the third line committee. We need to switch them out. And the same with the Travarine, a bigger pill burden. There might already be cross-resistance from old NRTIs. It's actually being removed from the SA market. So if you see people on a Travarine, we might even have the odd ones still in our clinic. We need to start switching them out. So the principles are very simple. We're always going to aim to use TLD3 where we can, but you can only do it if you have a backup regimen. So we always want to think in the future, because remember, these are patients who already have a lot of mutations in the mix. TLD3 has a potential risk of dolutegravir resistance in the future, and therefore we really need to make sure that we still have darunavir ritonavir. And so in terms of whether we can use TLD3 depends on the mutation score for darunavir ritonavir. So this is what the Stanford scores look like, where they give you like a nice little number for each of your ARVs, depending on the mutations. And so if darunavir ritonavir is fully susceptible, you can use TLD3 on its own. And then we're going to go through them all very quickly and what the actual algorithm says. But you can see as soon as it there is some mutations, then you've got to add darunavir to the mix to try and protect that TLD3. And then we have to use the BD dosing. So this is what the algorithm looks like. There's a very nice, beautiful printed algorithm, which I will send around as well when we send around the recording. If there's no darunavir resistance in some, so these are people who've had PI resistance. We don't see that many of them, but that's also important if you're wanting to switch people out at the moment that is on their third line regimens, and you have to look into the history. They have to have had no darunavir resistance to get TLD3, and then depending on their EGFR, you can either use TAFAT or ALD. If they've got darunavir resistance, we're going to use that TLD3 with twice daily darunavir, and if there's a high resistance score, you discuss with ADREC, so that I've just said. If they've got dolutegravir resistance, and they PI naive, so never in their history have they had lopinavir, ritonavir, or atazanavir before, we can assume that there is usually no PI resistance. Remember, the test won't tell us because we don't have any darunavir in the mix. So we do know we've got that darunavir ritonavir as a backup. And then whether any NRTIs will work, whether mutants or not, as we've said. And so those patients will end up on the tenofovir FTC and that darunavir ritonavir daily dosing. Nice and easy. So those are people who are failing on dolutegravir. It's a lovely option for our patients who's never been exposed to PIs. But if you've got a patient who's got a history who had PI resistance, then was changed to dolutegravir, now it's dolutegravir resistance, then you're going to have to discuss with ADREC on what we're going to do with those patients. The other category that's a little bit tricksy is patients who's got dolutegravir resistance, who's had previously been exposed to a PI. So remember I said in that when we switched everybody in 2023, even if they'd been on PIs for longer than 2 years with high viral loads, if we thought, no, there's probably just adherence, we switched them all. We weren't doing resistance tests. And so we might have patients who are on TLD2, but we got no idea if they have got cross-resistance to darunavir ritonavir. So the recommendation they make is quite an interesting one, and they actually recommend, so remember these are patients where you can't use dolutegravir, that we try them on the tenofovir FTC darunavir ritonavir daily, the easy regimen. But within 3 months, you do a viral load, because remember, you need drug pressure to pick up the mutations. So if the patient's got darunavir ritonavir mutations, then the darunavir ritonavir you'll give them will wipe out all the wild virus, but the mutations will remain and will be replicating. And so when you do your viral load, if it's after 3 months and it's more than 400 copies, then you can do a resistance test. Okay, so this is a slightly tricksy, interesting scenario that we hopefully will not be in too often because we don't see that much dolutegravir resistance. So there's a third line algorithm who uses this algorithm. Of course, the members of the third line committee, it's partly to standardize it across the committees, but also as a pharmacist, you can double check that your patient is on the right regimen, especially if they've been on third line for many years to see, well, maybe we can upgrade this particular thing. But they also make a recommendation. Say you've got a patient that you've now referred to the third line committee. You've got them back, they've got PI resistance, And you can see from the algorithm, actually, this patient qualifies for TLD3. They've got no darunavir resistance. Then you can switch them to TLD3 while you're waiting for the outcome. So while you're waiting you're still going to apply to the third line committee. You're going to tell them this is what you're going to do. And very important, if you put them on TLD3, you've got to register them as a third line regimen. And we do not want those patients to end up in the clinics, because the clinic is not going to realize that this patient is a TLD3. It's going to get lost somewhere along the way. So we want to keep them in places like our advanced care clinical unit here at CMH. But the third line committee must know about these patients over time. So our existing third line regimens, we can optimize using that algorithm. And one of the things we've been doing down here is we go back and look at the genotype. If we see there was no darunavir resistance and the patients are nicely suppressed, we either can look at TLD3 or we can put them on the once daily darunavir ritonavir. So this is the HIV helpline for those of you that the expert helpline. And on the forms that's actually in the 2023 guidelines, that is the email address of the third line committee.